So in this video, I'm going to talk about how we do Bayesian kriging. And here I'm talking about the sense of, uh, in the last video, I described how we would fit a Bayesian spatial model based on some spatial covariance matrix. So we've assumed that we fit that model. And when we fit that model, what we get out are estimates of all the parameters and their joint posterior parameter distribution. The question would then be, how do we make predictions using that spatial model? So first, we would start by fitting that spatial model. Like I said, we're going to fit the spatial model. We're going to get those parameters. We're going to get the full posterior distribution. And then we would want to, if we want to then make predictions with a confidence interval and a predictive interval around that, we can do that post hoc in R, very much the same way we've been doing that post hoc in R throughout the semester, where we have a little bit of code afterwards where we loop over the different parameter values, and we sample from the parameters and we calculate the predicted value, and then we use that to make the confidence interval, and then we make, we simulate data and we use that to make the predictive interval. So we're going to be doing the same thing in a spatial model, but there's a couple tricks that are special to spatial models related to how we handle that spatial covariance matrix. So the second thing we need to do to make predictions with a spatial model is that we need to compute this D pred. So when we fit the model, we had D, which is the matrix of all the pairwise distances between our n data points. And D pred is now an n plus m matrix of all the pairwise distances between the current endpoints and the m points that we want to make predictions to. So maybe we had n data points originally, but now we have some grid that we want to make predictions to. And so that grid might have m data points on it. And so we now need to know all those pairwise distances. Now, as we set up our code to calculate the confidence intervals and predictive intervals, and we're going to iterate over the parameter samples from the MCMC. We're going to go through this in a couple of steps. First, we need to calculate the C pred, which is the covariance matrix using this D pred distance matrix. So we use that D pred distance matrix to make C pred covariance matrix. And then we need to calculate the mean and variance that we use to make those predictions. So the mean that we use to get the confidence interval involves the mu pred, so the predictions from our process model for these new locations. And then it involves this ugly looking bit of matrix math that accounts for the spatial covariance component. So how the spatial component of the model is adjusting that mean prediction from our process model based on the spatial covariances. And this looks ugly, but we can break it down and say, from the back end first we have this distance between the original data set Z and the prediction. So this is our kind of our residual errors that we're trying to explain the spatial pattern of those residual errors. This CSS, as we'll see in the next slide where we talk about submatrices, is the component of that overall predictive covariance matrix that involves the covariance between the original points. So this is our original covariance matrix, and taking the inverse of that, and this is kind of analogous. The matrix analog would be by dividing, our data minus the mean divided by the covariance. So this is very essentially the spatial covariance equivalent of calculating a z-score of our residuals. And now we then need to translate those normalized residuals into this new covariance matrix. And what really matters in that to make predictions isn't the full covariance matrix, it's just the component of that covariance matrix, component of CPRED that describes the covariance between our original data points and our new data points. And so that's essentially what it's going to be doing. The other way of viewing this is this C S prime S times C SS inverse is essentially going to give us a set of weights. And we're going to, and points that are near, our points from our original data set that are near to where we want to make predictions are going to get a higher weight, and points that are very far away from our original predictions are going to get a very low weight. And essentially we're then going to be, in matrix form, summing up all of those weights and summing up all those residuals in order to adjust the mean up or down. So, let's say there was a residual error, a very large positive residual error, very close to the point that we're making a prediction to, then that would be upweighted, and it would pull the prediction at this place up, because it would say, well, the other data points around here had positive errors, so we're going to pull this up. Cool. And then for the variance, there's another ugly term that involves submatrices where we have the spatial covariance just among the new points, this spatial covariance among the original points, the spatial covariance between the new points and the old points, and then the original or the the nugget variance, this non-spatial component of the variance. So this is calculating the overall mean, the overall variance for our predictions. And so to make a predictive interval, we would then draw our z-pred from a normal distribution with this expected value and that variance. Yeah, so that's what it would do. And this actually solves for a full covariance matrix. You would have, in reality, you'd have a vector of predictions and a covariance matrix of variances for making new predictions. So this slide just shows you a little bit more about what this submatrix is about. So for that overall covariance matrix, CPRED, you have your original data points N, you have your new points you're making predictions to M, and that would give you this CSS, the submatrix of the original data points, the covariance between the original data points. And then we have these two symmetric versions of the covariance between the original data points and the new points, the covariance between the new points and the original data points, and then this larger submatrix here, which is the covariance among the points you're making predictions to. And the relative size of N and M just depend on how many points you make predictions to. Traditionally, if you're trying to make a map of something, you probably have more points that you're trying to make a map for than you have in the original data set. So it's not unusual for this submatrix to be bigger. Before we kind of wrap up spatial covariance models, I want to end with a couple words of warning that spatial modeling is non-trivial, and it has, even though we can write down a spatial model in a way that really doesn't add much more code to our maximum likelihood or Bayesian model, it can add a number of additional challenges to getting those models to fit well. So one of the challenges when working with spatial models is singularities. And singularities are either covariance matrices that either in a pure sense can't be inverted, or in a numerical sense, in practice can't be inverted using numerical routines. So one key part is no covariance matrix can have zeros that are off the diagonal. So in your distance matrix, the only zeros that are allowed in your distance matrix are the ones along the diagonal. You can't have a distance of 0 between 2 points. So you can't have two measurements at the same location at the same time with distance 0 between them, because that would cause a 0 off the diagonal and would mess up the matrix inversion. And that applies in an absolute sense. And then the other challenge numerically is if the smallest distances in your distance matrix are a lot smaller, orders of magnitude smaller than the biggest distances in your distance matrix. This is cause what are called numerical singularities, where we can't invert the distance matrix without round off errors causing things to go to 0, or without loss of numerical precision, such you get kind of really funky results, or most often you just have your code failing because you've proposed a matrix, a spatial covariance matrix that can't be inverted. Cool. So that's one thing to watch out for. The other thing to remember is that when we do this spatial modeling, we have to have this covariance matrix, and as you look back at the math, we're taking the inverse of that spatial covariance matrix a lot, and so any sort of kriging requires large and computationally expensive matrix multiplications and matrix inversions. And so, just the computational demand of spatial models goes up a lot because of the computational cost of matrix algebra. And to give you an idea, a matrix inversion implemented naively is what's called an order n cubed operation, which means if n is the dimension of the covariance matrix, the time it takes to do that calculation scales as the cube of n. Another way of putting that, if I double the size of my spatial covariance matrix, I double the number of points in it, the time it takes to invert that matrix does not double. It goes up 2 to the 8th, 2 to the 4th, sorry, it goes up 2 to the 3rd, or it goes up a factor of 8. So every time you double the size of a spatial covariance matrix, the time it takes to do any operation on that of inverting it goes up a factor of 8. If I make it 10 times bigger, the computational cost goes up 10 to the 3rd or 1,000. So matrix inversion costs a lot more when you have large spatial matrix, or any large covariance matrix. That can be very computationally costly. The other thing to remember, in that you have to do that for every MCMC iteration. So you don't just have to do it once, you have to do it every iteration. And then finally, if you're doing spatial predictions, remember that the output of this is a map. And not just one map, but you're producing a map every MCMC iteration. So if you have a large spatial domain, you might end up with 10,000 maps. And so memory itself can be a concern with this sort of spatial with these sort of spatial models. That said, there are a lot of clever approaches out there in the more advanced spatial modeling literature to help deal with some of these challenges. But the hope here is to present all of you with enough of a foundation to start getting your head around spatial models and kind of give you that initial exposure to spatial modeling, such that you can actually now start looking at some of these more advanced spatial methods.